Greetings, retro lover. It is Ethan, aka the Ghost Mall, coming to you yet again from my home studio here. And in this video, I wanted to try to answer the question, is there such a thing as retro chords? When it comes to writing retrowave music, music looking back to the 80s and 90s in particular, which is the period of time that I'm interested in replicating, is there something that we can say in general about the chords that were used in that kind of music and that we might use to recreate it today? I think that you can approach answering this question from a variety of different angles. Some of them are musical, some of them are technical, some of them are emotional, and some of them are historical. So let's start with the latter. So if you're interested in retro music, and that can mean a lot of things, obviously. Anything old can be retro, but in particular, I'm talking about the styles of music that I work on for the Ghost Mall, so 80s music, early 90s, maybe later 70s. But what the concept of retro wave music, or if you want to call it even 80s revival music, what that means to me might not be what it means to you. And that has to do with the fact that time periods are not genres, right? They're not styles. I was born in 1980, and so I was there for, the period of time that I'm interested in recreating. And, it's an absolute certainty that every style of music that was at least extant up to that point was being made throughout the whole decade. Now, of course, there have been subsequent genres of music that didn't exist then. Obviously, dubstep wasn't a thing when I was a kid. Trap music, the concept of what that was, hadn't been invented yet. But, there were people making and topping charts with rock music, hip-hop music, which was in its infancy then, but still country music, pop music, you name it. And so when we asked the question about chords and sort of voicings and harmony, that was going to vary significantly across genres of music. So when you picture 80s retro music, for example, if you picture, glam rock or certain subgenres of metal, for example, or hip hop music, the way that harmony and chord progressions and chord voicings is approached in each of those styles of music is different. So what I'm going to talk about today is more particularly about 80s and early 90s pop music and some of the origins of the kinds of chords that are used in that kind of music, and what we can say in general about them and where they came from. So when you think of 80s pop, for example, of course, the first name that's going to come into your head, at least it is for me and probably for you too, is Michael Jackson, the king of pop, right? Other, megastars from the time like Madonna. The thing to know about their music was that it was heavily rooted in and inspired by R&B music. And if you trace that rabbit hole down even deeper, what you're going to find is that most R&B music has its roots in jazz music, if you go back far enough. And so when we talk about jazz voicings or jazz chords, that means a lot of things more that are more technical that hopefully in this video I'm going to break down a little bit for you. But knowing that type of harmony and where it comes from definitely can help you recreate certain aspects of that style of music. And all pop from that era, you can also think about another major font of inspiration for me are the British acts of the mid-80s. So in America, the movement that we called the Second British Invasion, and that in music press from Britain was often called like new music, for example. But if you think of acts like Howard Jones, Human League, Tears for Fears, my biggest inspiration, Naked Eyes, those types of acts, they weren't coming from the same place, and they weren't necessarily as influenced by R&B music per se, but definitely the same kinds of chord additions, the kinds of things that added flavor to their music were similar. So that's a bit of a historical note about that. Now let's talk about the emotional side of talking about chord voicings and choosing chords. I'm a huge believer in the idea that every aspect of music exists only to elicit some kind of an emotion, right? And that more elaborate, sophisticated, and maybe complex variations of chords are capable of eliciting more subtle and nuanced kinds of emotions. So I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about chord construction here. And I should probably also have started off this video with this caveat, but let me just say it now. Disclaimer, this video is definitely aimed more at somebody who has a beginning or to maybe no knowledge at all of music theory. If you are a music producer who maybe is into a certain sound but feel like you can't get there in terms of complicated chords or whatever, this might be for you. Or even if you're just a fan of this music and you're curious about, hey, this, hearing this kind of a chord gives me this kind of a feeling that it really conjures up the sound of, the 80s or whatever have you, then this might be for you. If you already are a person who has had a lot of experience with music theory and has, knowledge of what different intervals are and what an add 9 chord is or whatever, this probably is going to bore you to death. But if not, stick with me and I'll try to walk you through that. So again, back to the notion of emotions. Ideally, if we're creative people, whatever art we're making, we're not just trying to elicit really black and white kinds of emotions like, well, I heard that song, it made me feel really happy, or that song made me feel sad or whatever. Ideally, we're able to conjure up a whole spectrum of emotions that are more subtle and maybe more ambivalent. So everything from like, maybe not happy, maybe it's excited or joyful, and maybe not sad, maybe it's, sort of melancholic or pensive or whatever. And I find that that's a really good metaphor for building chords. So what I've got open here for you, hopefully you can see this right now, is just my DAW sonar here. And I've got a MIDI instrument. This is a really, classic 80s sound, that Yamaha DX electric piano. Thought I would go with that to play the chords with today. That's what you're seeing over here on the right. On the left is a really cool little plugin. If you're a music producer who's interested in exploring this further, I would definitely suggest picking this up because it's free. It's called MIDI Chord Analyzer, and it's by insert Piz here. It's a manufacturer I've never heard of before downloading this, but it's a free download. I got it from KVR. And what it does is it allows you to visualize when you play a chord, it's going to tell you what it is. And so it's a great learning tool. So if you're playing along and you're like, oh, I dig that chord, what is it? Well, it turns out it's an F major 7th. You might not have known that, but now you do, and it can kind of give you that feedback. But it's also going to be good for the purposes today of walking you through some of this. So we talked a little bit about maybe the origins of the kinds of chords that at least I associate with 80s and early 90s pop, and why you might be interested in learning chords beyond just a basic, set of chords. And it's really about evoking emotion, right? So what I'm going to do is play you a couple of chord progressions from songs that I have written for the Ghost Mall, and you're going to get probably a sense for the flavor of the kinds of chords that I use frequently. Then I'm going to talk a little bit more about what they are and how they're built, and I'm going to try to approach this from a standpoint of, like I said, maybe somebody who's really new to music theory, and just talk about how we build things from the bottom up, from the root up. But let's just play a little bit here. So there's one chord progression, and I'm going to break down some of the chords that were in that. Here's another tune I've been working on recently, or the chorus of it. And here's maybe we'll do one more. And so those are the kinds of chord progressions, chord voicings that I like to use. And while it was jumping around pretty quickly there, you probably saw that there are a lot of extensions, right? There were 7s and 9s, and maybe there were some 11s in there. I'm going to talk to you about what those are and sort of where you start and where you get to. I'm going to try to start, just giving you my examples in the key of C. Now, to take this to a really, really fundamental point, obviously when you're playing on a keyboard, you have your white keys and your black keys. And if you play a scale that is just the white keys, beginning on the note C and ending on the note C, you have a C major scale. That's also called the Ionian mode. These black keys, which by themselves, just as an aside, create a pentatonic scale, are accidentals with respect to the C major scale, which means they're not included. So we're just going to stick with the white keys here and the C major scale as a starting point to explain some of this. So when we talk about chords, another word that we use is harmony. Harmony is anytime we have more than one note and they create a relationship which is more than just the sum of its parts. So if we have just single notes, we have, something monophonic, we might have a melody. Right, one note at a time. But as soon as we introduce even one more note, we have a harmony. And this is where I think the ability to create and conjure emotions really starts to come in, because the relationship between notes can either be pleasing to the ear or, displeasing. So this interval, for example, creates quite a different feeling than this interval does. This is a major third. This is a minor third, as you can see up here on the screen. And I just said thirds, and that's going to be a really important concept for you to understand if you want to learn more about chords and how they're built. So Western music, for the most part, is based on what's called, it's often called tertiary harmony, and tertiary just indicates the notion of third, like the number 3. And so a third is either, let's use C as the root here, a major third, which is 2 whole steps up. So let's switch to the keyboard here so maybe you can see this better. Should be seeing my keyboard now. So here's a half step. This is a whole step. So 2 whole steps, 1, 2, forms a major third. If instead you drop the top note down a half step, now you have a minor third, which is, 1 whole and 1 half step up from the root. Well, okay, so why is this important? Because thirds are really the building blocks of chords and how we think about them, how we build them, and their nomenclature in Western music. And also, they have inherent emotional kinds of connotations, right? So a major third is often talked about as something that has a happy, undertone, or a uplifting or a positive sound, whereas a minor third has maybe a darker sound or a sadder sound, something more melancholic or just dark in some way. And when we build chords out from here, we're going to be building based on these units of major thirds or minor thirds and sort of stacking them up. Now, you can stack them up like this, for example. We have a series of thirds. But you can also move these notes around. So, for example, I could take this top note, this G, put it down here on the bottom, and it's still the same chord, it's just in a different voicing, right? And for example, if you take a regular old C chord, you can play it here. You can drop the top note down. You can drop the top note down again. And if you drop the top note down one more time, you've just got what you had before, an octave lower. So drop the top note, drop the top note, drop the top note. Those are called inversions. But the idea here is that even though we might take those notes and move them around and drop them or raise them, we're basing it on a series of relationships from the root note in thirds, right? For example. Okay, so now we've talked about harmony, the idea that there is some kind of inherent emotional value in note relationships, and that we build chords by stacking primarily thirds in tertiary harmony. Now, as an aside, we should notice that, or should, bring to your attention that rules are made to be broken. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about the types of chords, how you can extend using thirds, but there are always going to be versions of harmony that include more than just thirds and maybe aren't even based on thirds to begin with. And what's more, there are going to be numerous times when you're going to go out of the relationships which are inherent in the key that you're working in and sort of break those rules. And that's some of where the most interesting stuff starts. But in the interest of making this more for beginners, I'm going to keep it to the notion of what chords belong logically within a key. And as a matter of fact, I'm not going to really talk in this video too much about chord changes so much and sort of how you go from one chord to the next and what kind of emotion those kinds of changes and what's called voice leading can evoke, but more just about chords themselves individually as units and sort of the sound that they have. All right, so starting here with the C note, let me go back to the DAW so you can see again. Hopefully you've got the whole picture here. With the chord analyzer, if I add a major third on that, it's just going to tell you it's a major third. And that's not really a chord yet. That's just a dyad, something made with two notes. Dyads, have value in music, but most chords, basic chords, are triads, which is to say they have three notes, okay? So this is a C major chord, just about the most basic chord you can get. It has 3 notes, hence triad. And the relationships are as follows. We've got a major third here, but a minor third on the top. So one major third, and then stack a minor third on top, you've got a C major chord. And as you can see, it kind of has a bright, sunny, happy kind of sound. However, if you take this middle note, which is really crucial, which is the third of this chord, this is the first, this is the third, this is the fifth, right? Logical. First, second, third, fourth, fifth note in the sequence, in the scale from the root. If you take that third and lower it a half step, now you have a minor chord, because you've changed this bottom relationship from a major third to a minor third, and now it's a minor chord. Really different sound, right? Really much darker sound. Now, these are going to be our basic building block chords, a major triad and a minor triad. From there, we're going to branch out to adding notes on top of those, for example. But they're not the only triads, so I should, in passing, just note here that you can, by moving in increments of half steps, you can change the basic triad in a few ways. So here's major, here's minor. Now, what if, in addition to dropping this third, I drop the fifth? That's called a diminished chord. It has a kind of dissonant quality to it. Well, the reason is, if you go up from the root C, in that chord is something called a tritone. This is a really interesting harmony. And it points out again how just 2 notes, just harmonizing 2 notes can have really, its own emotional impact. A tritone is just about the most dissonant interval of 2 notes that you can get. In fact, in classical music, and this story might be apocryphal, who knows, I don't know, but the idea, the notion was that in classical times, this interval, which was also called like the devil's interval, was prohibited in certain forms of music because it was considered to be, a gateway for ill omens and bad spirits through music. They call it the devil in music. Well, that interval is part of this diminished chord, so it has a dissonant and dark quality because you are lowering 2 intervals relative to the root. So you've got our major triad, our minor triad, we've got our diminished triad. What if we go the opposite direction and elevate a note from the major triad? If we also raise the fifth, that's an augmented chord, and it has its own sound. It kind of creates a kind of tension that wants to resolve in another direction. Okay, so now you know about basic triads: major chord, minor chord, diminished, augmented. What does this have to do with retro music, right? Well, from here, we need to talk about chord extensions. And I'm going to show you some of my favorite, what might be called jazz chords, but that definitely worked their way, through that lineage of jazz and R&B music into 80s and early 90s pop music and dance music and stuff. So the first, most basic set of extensions are seventh chords. This is a C major seventh chord. Well, why is it a seventh? Because in addition to the first, third, and fifth, I've added the seventh note up from the root. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That's a major seventh chord. Now, that is the seventh built on the major triad. What if we had a minor triad? The minor seventh is this note, just a half step lower, just like the third is a half step lower. And these are probably the most commonly used chords with extensions in all forms of music that want this kind of a sort of smooth, jazzy, if you will, spice or angle to their music. So I use these chords constantly. And just staying within the confines of C major, for example, each note, if you build a triad and a seventh chord on top of it, is going to have its own relationship. So the root note, I'm just going to do triads for now. If you start with the root note, you have C major, then you have a D minor, E minor, F major, G major, A minor, B diminished on the seventh scale degree, and back to C minor, or C major, excuse me. So in a major Ionian key like this, you have three chords that are major chords. The 1, the 4, and the 5. Everything else is minor, except for this seventh, which is diminished. So basically, why is this important? Every key, if you're starting with a major key, is going to have a set of chords that are logical or consonant within that key. Now, like I said, breaking rules is a big part of music, and you're going to want to go out of key sometimes and do what's called chord substitution, and that's beyond the scope of this video, but I'm going to add some links, I think, in the description to this video to some other YouTube channels where I've learned a ton about chord substitution. So if this beginning video piques your interest, you can go check those out. The rabbit hole for chord extensions and chord voicings goes really deep, and I have a lot left to learn. But point is that you can expect in your key that the logical chords are going to be the 1, 4, and 5 are major, and then you've got the 2, the 3, the 6 is minor, and the 7 is diminished. And if you add sevenths from there, you also start to get a combination of major seventh and minor sevenths, which, goes along logically with those triads. So add the seventh to the C major triad, you get C major 7. Add a seventh to the D minor triad, you get D minor 7, and so on. E minor 7, F major 7, G dominant 7, which is, a different sound. Listen to the F major 7. G dominant 7th has a bit of a different sound, and that's because the relationships are different here. So that's a major third. That's a minor third, and so what we have just is the basic G triad here, right? And then if you wanted to have a G major 7th chord, which again, you'd have to go outside of the key. You'd have to raise this 7th. Staying within the key with this lowered 7th, half a step, you get a dominant 7th. So coming back to our original C chord here, we had C major 7th, we decided. We have C minor 7th. And we've changed 2 notes to get from the major 7th to the minor 7th, the 3rd and the 7th. But what if we only changed this one? That's a dominant 7th chord. All right, so going through again, we've got our C major 7, D minor 7, E minor 7, F major 7, G dominant 7, A minor 7. And this, so this is because it's built on the diminished chord, is going to be a slash chord, which I might talk a little bit more about later, and back to a C major 7. Okay, so what's the takeaway from up to this point? We build chords based on thirds, major thirds and minor thirds, and stacking them. And if you want to go beyond just 1/3, you stack and you get a triad. And you can have major triads, minor triads, diminished triads, or augmented. And if you want to go even further into spicing up the chords, the next step is the 7th. And you got your major 7ths, you got your minor 7ths, you got your dominant 7ths. And adding major and minor 7ths to your music, just in the place of the regular major and minor triads, wherever it sounds good, is immediately going to give your music a jazzier, smoother, kind of more sophisticated pop kind of sound, which I think lends itself to retrowave music brilliantly. And again, you can take these notes and you can move them up or down. So here's a trick that I like to do. This is maybe more just sort of a trick or hack than anything else. But what I like to do sometimes is, let's take, for example, a C major 7th. Well, what if I drop this 7th, this flavor note, from being the top down to being a lower position? It has a different sound. And sometimes what I like to do is just to keep my my fingers a little happier here and not have to have these 4-note voicings all the time, is I'll take a C major and I'll make it a C major 7th just by dropping this root down here. And that has a really nice sound to it. I do that all the time. It's to make a 7th without having a big stack of 4 notes. Just drop this root, and as long as I have this in the bottom hand, the root note, you've got a C major 7th. Yeah, same thing with the minor 7th, for example. So in the key of C major, let's take, this is E minor 7th, right? Still in the key here. And actually one interesting thing is you can start to think about the relationships between these chords. Here, if I play a C major 7th, which we were just experimenting with, and I take out the bottom note, and I make this the bottom note, and I add another third to the top, now I have an E minor 7th. But same thing goes here. I can do the same trick. Take this top, the 7th note, and we're just gonna drop it down here. The 7th note, let's drop it down. That has a nice sound to it. So you can take these 7th chords and you can begin to move around and invert the notes in interesting ways. But the point is that you've got a relationship between the higher notes and the root, which creates this kind of cool set of emotions. Like I said, major 7th chords have this really smooth sound. Here's a progression I've been working on lately. And that starts with a major 7th to a minor 7th. And then we actually get a nice segue here. The next logical addition, which are 9 chords. Okay, so let's go back to our root. Got a C, stack a third on there to get a major third, stack a minor third to get a C major chord, stack another third, we've got our C major 7th. What happens if we stack another one? So this is a C major 9 chord. And why is it a 9? Well, back to another basic, very, very basic building block of music theory, but if you didn't already know, so you go 8 notes, 8 letter notes before you start repeating. And they're C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C in this case. But if you start with A, the first letter of the alphabet, you go A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and that's it. You start over with A, B, C, D, E, F, G again. And so the concept of the octave is really important in music, because an octave, which means, octo, 8, just like octopus has 8 arms, an octave is when you have the same note repeated, because it's 8 notes apart. There's an octave of C, another octave of C, octave of A, and you see MIDI chord analyzers telling me there's an octave. Well, once you go beyond that octave, that 8th note, you start to get 9ths, 10ths, 11ths, 12ths, 13ths. But the important thing to remember is that there are other ways to think of these notes, because this ninth is also just the second. It's a D note. As I go further up, it gets further and further away from this root, but even though this is called a ninth, and yes, it is 9 notes away, this D is the same note as this second. And this 10th is really just a major third, and this 11th is a perfect fourth. So this chord, which is one of my favorite chords, is called a G add 9. Another way to think of it is if you just take this G major chord and you fill in the space here between the first and the third with a second, that's an add 9 chord. One of my very favorite voicings and very favorite chords. And while, yeah, it is a ninth, technically, it would be a ninth if it was up here. If you bring that down and just sort of fill this in to make a real tight voicing, it's really the second. So, okay, so we've got 7th chords, we've got 9 chords. And, things go on from there. 11th chords. You can actually have a lot of fun sort of playing these really thick stacks of third intervals and just sort of see how far you can take it sometimes. Obviously, the more you start to stack these thirds and the further you start to extend these chords, the more complex of a sound it's going to be, and sort of maybe emotionally ambivalent. This is clearly, major has a happy sound, minor has a, maybe a sadder sound. But tell me what kind of emotion that C major 11 chord evokes in you. I don't know. It might be different from you to me to another person. But the point is that it's adding extensions to your chords in this way starts to expand your palette of emotions that you can access with your music. I think I've explained enough about how you can build these chords using just simple major and minor thirds and stacking them, and experiment. I mean, especially if you pick up a plugin like MIDI Chord Analyzer, you can just say to yourself, okay, well, I know that a major third is 4 half steps. And what happens if I stack another major third on top? Okay, that's an augmented chord. What if I make this a major third and a minor third? Well, that's a major triad. What happens if I don't know, I've got these stacked. What if I stack up another 2 whole steps? That's a C major 7. What if this is a minor third? Well, that's a C dominant 7. And you can start to learn, what these chords are called, if that's helpful to you. But more importantly, you start to learn how taking just these basic building blocks of major thirds and minor thirds and stacking them up, and then from there, maybe moving the notes around a bit, but keeping the same notes, just changing their relationship high or low, can yield really cool results. So I think the only other thing that I'm going to do right now is maybe just play a little bit through some more chord progressions from my own music and talk to you about how I employed these types of voicings in my music. So the first one is I played, I think, from a song I wrote called Say You Will. It's not been released yet, but I did do another video a while back where I sort of break down my production of that whole song. So please check that out if you're interested. But it starts with a G major to a B minor to an A major. And simple enough, right? These are very vanilla chords. G major triad, B minor triad, A major triad. Not only are they vanilla chords, but they're vanilla voicings. They're not inverted. It's just root, third, fifth, root, third, fifth, root, third, fifth. So what I do in the song is I actually play the chords this way a couple times. For that little last part, I don't add the fifth. I'm just doing a dyad there. And then to add some spice, when it comes back around again, I start to add extensions like this. So So what have I done there? I've gone from it being a major triad, minor triad, major triad, to that add 9 voicing we were talking about, where I've stuck that second in there. Is it this really thick, warm sound? There's that B minor 7th, but instead of having it root 3rd, 5th, 7th, I'm doing that trick I already talked to you about, dropping the 7th down and replacing this root with it. But I've got the root in the left hand. Another add 9 chord. So I've gone from 2. Doesn't that just have a more satisfying sort of thick sound to it? And that was just by adding some 7ths and some 9ths and sort of finding good places to tuck them into the voicing. Another example this is a song I'm working on called Bite My Tongue. It's not released yet either, but this is like a pre-chorus section. And so let's break that down a bit. This is just a regular old C major chord. Couldn't get much more vanilla than that. But what I do is I play around by taking this and dropping these notes. Now by itself, that's a super vanilla progression. C major to G major. It just happens that this C major is in its first inversion. So here's a C major triad, drop the top note, there's a C major chord. It says over G because I haven't got the root down here. But C major chord to G major chord. But what I don't do is this. Very vanilla. Because I'm not actually changing from C major to G major. That's not my intention. I keep the C in the root. So what I'm doing is quickly going from C major to G add 11 over C, right? There's a G add 11 in a tight voicing. You can hear it almost sounds dissonant. But if I take that dissonant note and make it the root, it has a really cool, warm, jazzy kind of sound. So, and that's just moving these two notes back and forth. And I do the same thing there, right? But the chords that are formed are different because it's on the basis of a D minor chord instead of a C major chord. And then we've got a good old E minor 7 stacked up from the bottom. And then I do a chord substitution here. I move from the minor 7 to the dominant 7, which is technically going to take it out of key, but that's a very commonly used substitution. Just moving that one note, that third, a half step, creates a real emotional change. And again, we're just using some extensions here. In this case, 11ths and some 7th chords, a minor 7 and a dominant 7. But we're making it much more interesting and emotionally rich. Because if I was just to play, that's pretty boring to my ear. We've got a regular C major, D minor chord, E minor chord. But this has a lot more going on, right? So those last two progressions, all we've introduced were some major 7th, minor 7th, add 9, and add 11 chords with a different root there, with the 11th as the root. Let's see. Maybe just one more example, and then I'm going to wrap this up. So this is another song that I'm working on. It's as of yet untitled, but the progression's something like this. So what's happening there? We got a G major chord, and it's the same trick I already just showed you in the last progression. It's dropping these top two notes down to create an add 11. At least in this case, but then I move the root down. And here's another trick that you can experiment with. Take a triad in the right hand, like it could be just a regular G major triad like I'm doing here, except I've inverted it by dropping this note down. And mess around with placing different roots from the key underneath. And you start to get really interesting things, really just taking a triad and experimenting with what you can put underneath it can be really interesting. So if I've got this G major triad here, we go from G major to D add 11. Okay, but if I play the exact same thing in the right hand, but make this the root, now we've got an E minor 7 and a D add 9. Okay, let's drop the root again. And there's a D dominant 7. So you can start to see how the shapes I'm using are really simple, but by simply moving around the root note underneath the triad and then actually working with these two triads, because that's all I'm doing in the right hand, I start to get a sequence of like 6 really cool chords. And then I go A minor to D major. And what another point of advice when experimenting with more complicated, sophisticated chords is that you don't want everything to be all the time. You know, nobody wants everything all the time. And in music, like I've mentioned in a few other videos, you're always trying to create a balance between repetition and novelty, and also, you know, simplicity and complexity. And so it would be exhausting really to hear a song that was just unrelenting 7th chords, for example. So if you've done a little sequence like that where you've got some more complicated voicings, if you can then just give the listener a break to take it back to some really basic triads, that can be a nice contrast. So from there, actually, in this song, here's another good example. The pre-chorus goes something like this. Right? So I've got a C major, D major, back to C major. Really simple chords, like I showed you in the previous example, but the second time through, I add extensions. So it goes like this. That's the first vanilla time. Here's the second time. Whoops. Okay, so what have I done there? I've gone from C major, D major, B minor, and C major, and I've replaced it with C major 7, D add 9, B minor 7, and then I go to this A chord, which is taking it a little out of the key, actually. So, well, we've used it already in a previous sequence, but the point is that I've switched it up from this really plain old sequence to something with more character. All right, so I think I'm going to actually wrap it up there, but let's just recap quickly. So when it comes to retro music, especially 80s retro pop, the lineage of sort of where the types of chords that are used in it came from, it was heavily influenced by R&B music, which was heavily influenced by jazz music, and therefore chords with extensions like 7ths and 9ths and 11ths and whatnot really sound good and create a sort of evocative mood of that time. And speaking of evocative, the reasoning why you might want to use chords with further extensions in your music is so that you can paint with a spectrum of more complex kinds of emotions. And I showed you how you build up those chords with simple relationships, stacking either major thirds or minor thirds on top of one another, and then you can move the notes around. But as long as you've started with that foundation of stacking the thirds to create the chord, and then maybe you move them around a bit to invert them, that's fine too. And yeah, so I would encourage you to experiment with this yourself if you are a music producer. This is a brilliant tool, MIDI chord analyzer, to just sort of see what is it that I'm playing? Why could it possibly be that it sounds good? Now, what we didn't explore in this video are how to really link the chords together and do voice leading and what that can do to amp up the emotions of your music. Nor did we really talk about going outside of the box of playing the chords that come naturally and logically in a particular key and doing different kinds of substitutions and things like that. You can, like I said, go really deep down this rabbit hole and start doing modal substitution. So yeah, I'm going to put some links in the description of this video to a couple of YouTube channels that have been really helpful to me learning more about this kind of stuff. And I hope to continue to learn, and maybe as I do, I'll share more with you, but hopefully this was of some interest or use to you. And yeah, it's been really enjoyable. Again, I'm Ethan, aka the Ghost Mall. Thank you so much for your attention. I really hope it was fun or interesting or educational or all three. And look forward to seeing you in the next video. Take it easy, guys.